Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Wednesday, March 19th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Hi, Jacob. It's good to have you here. It is day 530 of the war. More strikes have been reported in Gaza for the second night running, with an overnight bombardment that was reported in several areas of the Gaza Strip. The IDF hasn't yet commented as of early Wednesday morning, hasn't commented or confirmed the strikes. The Houthi rebels launched a ballistic missile at Israel from Yemen on Tuesday evening, the first again in 2 months. It was intercepted by the IDF's long-range arrow system over Saudi Arabia. In the meantime, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Tuesday night that hostage talks would only be held, quote, under fire, and thousands in response protested across the country, some 40,000 in Tel Aviv alone, including recently freed hostages, all of them pressing the government to return to the negotiating table. And the freed hostages related the kinds of fears and terrors that hostages experienced during IDF bombardments. The protests were also about the prime minister's move to fire Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar, which has not taken place yet. We'll talk about the U.S. response to the Israeli resumption of the war, as well as the latest with the embattled U.S. hostage envoy Adam Boehler and the United States' tone toward the Palestinian Authority. Stay with us. Okay, so Jacob, we've just passed the second night of the resumption of war with Hamas, with strikes in Gaza. What have you been hearing? What has the U.S. response been over the last 24 hours? What were the first things that you were hearing as you started work yesterday morning?
Yeah, quite early. So the White House was very quick to respond. You had Caroline Leavitt, who's the press secretary, offering full-throttled support for Israel's military action. And she was on Fox News and was asked about her response. And she said that President Trump has made it clear the Hamas, the Houthis, Iran, all others who seek to terrorize not just Israel, but the United States will see a price to pay. All hell will break loose, is what she said, also quoting what Trump has said a few times. And she also noted that Israel had consulted with the U.S. in advance. So clearly the U.S. had also signed off, given a green light for Israel to basically collapse the ceasefire and move on with these strikes to try to lean on Hamas with some extra military pressure. In addition to that, we had the National Security Council spokesperson of the White House, Brian Hughes, who gave me a quote saying Hamas could have released the hostages to extend the ceasefire, but instead chose refusal and war. Then on Tuesday, you had the interim U.S. ambassador to the UN, Dorothy Shea, who's filling in until Elise Stefanik gets confirmed. There was a UN Security Council session about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These happen all of the time, so it forces all these different parties to give all these different talking points about their positions regarding the war. This was well-timed, I guess, because it was right after the ceasefire was broken. And you had Dorothy Shea say that Hamas is solely responsible for what's going on in Gaza. And she denied that the concept that Israel is indiscriminately killing Palestinians in Gaza. So very much a shift, or not very much, but there was a shift from the Biden administration, which also made a point to express its concern regarding civilian casualties. Here you have full-throttled support, no mention of any sort of criticism, giving Israel all the backing it needs. Notably, though, you haven't heard yet Donald Trump himself weigh in on this. He's been, I guess, mum. There's been opportunities he could have spoken. He's more focused right now on the Russia-Ukraine war and trying to get a ceasefire there. But it seems more broadly that you're having the U.S. adopt the Israeli approach to these negotiations. Israel refused to hold negotiations regarding the terms of Phase 2, which was the Phase 2 is supposed to start 2.5 weeks ago, and it did not because Israel refused to hold those talks. That was in violation of the deal, but the U.S. basically adopted that position and said, that's fine. We agree with Israel's desire effectively to try to get a different construct, a different framework for the deal. And that's why you had Steve Witkoff put forward this proposal last week, where he talked about extending phase one and getting out maybe about five living hostages. And he said Hamas's response to this was a non-starter. And basically, again, taking Israel's side and saying that the Hamas is the problem here in the negotiations, even though that the phase two is something that both sides had agreed to. We agree that now we're going to try something else, and therefore we accept the way Israel is handling it. And he urged Hamas to really get smart quickly, or hinting that there could be a resumption of the war. Trump himself talked about that he's armed Israel to the teeth, and Israel will carry out kind of this the dirty work for the U.S. in terms of how to deal with Hamas. You did have this brief period slightly before the Witkoff proposal where the U.S. did want to try something new because of the deadlock. You had Adam Boehler, the hostage envoy, hold these direct negotiations, several meetings with Hamas officials, which Israel wasn't thrilled about. But Hamas didn't respond quickly enough to that offer, and by the time it did on Friday, saying it was willing to release the American hostages, Idan Alexander and four other bodies, I think the U.S. had moved on. The U.S., I think, was a little bit overwhelmed and maybe embarrassed by the fact that they were leaked by Israel, and has since moved away from that framework, and is now just trying to take Israel's side on this completely. So that's, I guess, where the U.S. is right now. Could things change? Again, we haven't heard Trump talk. I think they're going to give this military pressure a chance. But I do think also that there is a consideration of what the consensus in Israel is. During the first Trump administration, there was this one issue that annexation that was clearly seen in the Trump administration as something that was, annexation of the West Bank is something that would be very controversial. And it purposely didn't really move forward in backing it because it saw that there wasn't full consensus between the parties. The same way it talked about its Trump peace plan. It wanted to get both Benny Gantz, the opposition head, and Netanyahu also behind it before it unveiled the plan. So that just notices how that this is something. I noticed that this is something that they do care about. And Trump himself in the White House a couple of weeks ago, when he's meeting hostages that were recently released, he asks what the Israeli public thinks about a deal. And I mention all this about consensus because I think it will be something important in how he takes into consideration when he decides whether or not to back the government's approach right now to resume fighting. We've seen polls over the past few weeks and months that suggest that the vast majority of the public, 60 to 75%, supports ending the war in exchange for a hostage deal. This is not where the government is, but that's where the public is. So I think maybe if you see mass protests, beyond not just the polls, but also mass protests, and I don't think what we saw really on Tuesday night is likely going to be enough. 40,000 people is quite a lot.
It's not what it used to be, right?
But it's not the hundreds of thousands that we saw before. If we do see larger protests, then I think you could see Trump taking that more into account and maybe pushing back against the approach of the government here. But for now, I think they are frustrated with Hamas's handling of negotiations. They didn't see enough flexibility in response to Witkoff's proposal last week, and they're going to try to give, it seems like, these military strikes a chance, maybe for a week or two. I think Netanyahu is trying to do them at least to get to passing a budget in a couple of weeks. That clearly seems to be a calculus here as well.
Right. Try to pass the budget and have bombardment of Gaza in the meantime. Yeah.
Yes, I think that solidifies that he's going to need Itamar Ben-Gvir to pass the vote, and this is something that he wants. And once you get your government shored up, maybe he'll be more willing to also Netanyahu himself to be more flexible in these talks. But for now, I think they're going to let the guns do the talking.
Jacob, just one more question. You brought up the protests, and it was said 40,000 last night, which is bigger than it has been in weeks, but it's certainly not the hundreds of thousands that it was. But of course, you also have freed hostages making statements about the fear and terror that they experienced during, 16 months of captivity during IDF bombardments, at the fear of what would happen possibly if the building that they were in, if the tunnel that they were in was bombarded, possibly crushing them. And also the fear and terror of their Hamas captors, whose entire demeanor would change when there were IDF bombardments. What I wanted to ask you was, a lot of these freed hostages, they mention President Trump. They thank President Trump. Keith Siegel, an American-Israeli dual citizen, spoke directly, in a sense, to President Trump. And what I'm wondering is, do we think those kinds of entreatments that hostages make toward Trump, do we think he hears that? Do we think he cares? How much do we think that plays into how he looks at this overall situation, the hostage situation specifically?
Yeah, I think it definitely plays a huge role. It seems, though, that what he's taken away from the meeting he held with that group of 7 or 8 hostages a couple weeks ago was just how horribly they were treated by Hamas. And maybe that leads him to say, look, we need to just eradicate this terror organization, and only through force, because they're so brutal. Or maybe it was that comment that I mentioned earlier about him asking whether or not the public supports the deal. And obviously you can expect, it wasn't reported how the hostages responded or the freed hostages responded, but you can imagine that they said, absolutely, the public supports this. They're willing to give up a lot, pull out of Gaza and release lots of terrorists in order to get these hostages back. That's what the public wants. I'm sure the hope is that's what stuck with Trump the most. I think I'll just note that I spoke with one relative of a hostage in Gaza, and they talked about how they recently reached out to Nitzan Alon, who is the IDF's hostage, I guess you could say, point person. And he said, they asked him, does the IDF realize what we're up against right now by returning to the fighting, and what this means for the hostages? And he tried to assure the families that, look, the IDF strikes are very pinpointed, and we're only going into areas that we know that there aren't any hostages in. But then he made a sad, I guess, admission, saying that it's not 100% clear. And if you mentioned Keith Siegel, he was moved 33 times in captivity. He's talked about. It's likely that the IDF doesn't know every time one of those 33 times that they were moved, and we are certain that the hostages again have been moved during these past 2 months during the ceasefire. So the hope is that the IDF knows exactly as much as possible where these hostages are. But clearly there's going to be a little bit of a guessing game to a degree when it's carrying out these strikes. And I think that's what's so alarming to these hostages. And I'm sure that's what they tried to impart on President Trump during their meeting with him. But Trump is also facing he's also hearing a lot from Ron Dermer and Netanyahu that are trying to argue in favor of these kinds of strikes. So we'll see which ones overrule, or which ones of those opinions Trump takes at heart the most.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's take a quick break. When we're back, we will talk a little bit more about Adam Boehler and about the Palestinian Authority and how the Trump administration is sharpening its tone toward them. So stay with us. Okay, sticking with hostages for another moment, but really sort of another side of it. So you spoke about Adam Boehler, hostage envoy, did not have such a successful several days and week last week working on this. And now he's hosting a summit, as you've reported, for fellow hostage envoys, but does not seem to be directly involved in the hostage negotiations for Israel. What's your take on all of this? What's happening with Adam Boehler? And are we going to be hearing about him on this issue any longer, do we think?
Yeah, so Adam Boehler's had quite a few weeks since it was leaked. I think it was on March 4th that he had been holding these secret talks with Hamas, basically the first ever known U.S. official to meet with Hamas, given that the U.S. designates Hamas as a terror organization. Doesn't typically meet with these kinds of folks, but this is someone who's also met during the first term with the Taliban to help negotiate talks on behalf of the Trump administration then. So is known to be involved in these kinds of things, and tried on behalf of the Trump administration. He wasn't going rogue or anything. This is something that Steve Witkoff signed off on and fully coordinated with him. But it was something that he was the one in charge and leading these talks, had several meetings with Hamas officials. And when Israel found out about it, was furious because it wasn't informed about it ahead of time fully. And it directed its ire completely at Boehler. And you had Ron Dermer call him up and really just go after him in this call for basically negotiating on Israel's behalf without Israel knowing about it. In order to get the release of American hostages, which is totally within his remit. But he was also trying to use those talks to try to get a larger deal or use those releases as a springboard for additional ones. But Israel didn't like it, and it's tried since then to get him completely sidelined from the track of any involvement in release of specifically in hostages in Gaza. He can do things elsewhere, but let's keep him out of the picture in with the Gaza talks. It seems like the Trump administration has responded in kind. Now Witkoff is the one now leading the talks. You had Rubio talk about this as just a one-off, the ones that Boehler held, and that Witkoff is the main envoy in charge here. I will note that there was a U.S. official who told me that Boehler will continue assisting the Witkoff and the Trump administration in efforts to try to get the hostages out of Gaza, but clearly a little bit more behind the scenes. And I think definitely Witkoff is going to be the one in charge right now. But I do think that another U.S. official told me that if the main channel that we've been trying to do, where you have mediators between the U.S. and Israel and Hamas, be it Egypt and Qatar, that if that fails, then we'll try to return to the direct track. Though for now, it seems like that's off the table. Boehler was holding this summit in Big Sky, Montana. He has this, I guess, a home in Yellowstone Club. I'm sure a very gorgeous home over there, and he's able to host a bunch of his counterparts. And that's what he's been doing for the past couple of days. But what was interesting is that you had the summit started on Monday, and it's gone through Wednesday. And you've had, before it took place, you had several of the participants actually reaching out, according to several I spoke with, to Boehler's office to try to make sure that it was still on. Because what happened on Friday was that Boehler, the White House, announced that he had withdrawn his nomination to become the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. So basically, this was going to be a Senate confirmed position at the level of ambassador, so quite senior. But he, I guess, decided that he was no longer going to seek that kind of fancy title. He'll still be working on this issue, but not with that Senate confirmation necessary. And what some officials I spoke with, that I guess were closer to him, tried to argue that this was because this was his decision, that he felt that there was all this red tape that came with being a presidential envoy and requiring Senate confirmation that made it actually harder to do his job. And he had already been seeing this over the past few weeks when he was just the nominee, of what it would mean once he's confirmed in terms of the people he's able to meet with, the issues he's able to tackle. So these U.S. officials tried to explain that actually it's better for him not to have this title. But there was another official I spoke with who said, no, this is actually about his concern in terms of having to go through the financial regulations and restrictions in terms of becoming a Senate confirmed nominee. That there are a lot of, he would have to maybe divest from certain assets. He's got this healthcare investment firm that he wants to continue to be able to run, possibly only doing this job part-time. And that was something that I guess the Senate, certain Republicans weren't so thrilled about, in addition to now hearing an earful from Israel over its objections to Boehler's talks with Hamas. And you had this reality that was kind of coming to light that it was going to be very difficult for him to get confirmed. So whether you want to believe it's because Boehler decided to do it to pull out, or whether it was because of the pressure that he was facing from Republicans, pick your reason for why it didn't move forward the way I guess it was initially planned to. But in the meantime, Boehler holds this conference with his counterparts that we were able to scoop about on Monday. And it's wrapping up today, and basically they issued a joint statement trying to talk about collaborating all these different countries, the U.S., Israel, the U.K., Germany, Austria, and Australia. So about a half a dozen countries who sent representatives. Notably, Israel did send a lower-level representative, not Gal Hirsch, who would be the direct counterpart. The Israeli official I spoke with said this did have to do with Israeli frustration with Adam Boehler, but there was still a representative there, and they issued the statement talking about ways that we can try to collaborate in order to make sure that this practice of hostage taking around the world is stomped out.
Yep, makes sense. All right, let's talk about our final topic just briefly. An article of yours that will go up on the site later today, about the Trump administration sharpening its tone against the PA, against the Palestinian Authority, but continuing to fund its security forces in the West Bank. And you had both the U.S. and a Palestinian official speaking to you about this. It's obviously of note right now because of the role that the Palestinian Authority is also possibly expected to play in Gaza. But of course, there are a lot of things that are up in the air right now. Tell us what brought you to this particular piece this week.
Sure. So if you remember about a month ago, February 10th, the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas signed this decree ending its controversial welfare policy, which is what critics called pay to slay, because it bases the amount of welfare stipends or the money that people get from who are in Israeli prisons based off of the amount of time they're served, the length of their sentence. So it was seen as incentivizing terror. Now, this new decree cancels that legislation and says that anyone who gets a welfare payment, it will be based strictly on financial need. So the U.S., it took 2 days, but it did welcome this move. It was something that multiple administrations had tried to pull off. Trump administration was the one who finally got it done, I guess you could say, even though most of the work was done during the Biden administration. But the PA, due to frustration with that administration, just chose to wait and give it as kind of a gesture of goodwill to the Trump administration and announced it quite early on during Trump's tenure. So you had a statement from the State Department that I got on February 12th welcoming the move and saying it was a big win for the Trump administration and appears to be a positive step in the right direction. But then I got a statement just a few days ago from the same State Department that took a much harsher line and said that this abhorrent practice needs to end now. We want to see actions, not words. We will be closely monitoring that the law is fully implemented, and we'll consult with the PA in Israel on developments. So a very different tone. I tried to get the State Department to explain why they chose to shift the way that they did. They didn't really want to give an answer. But at the same time, what I was following up on, and these are somewhat related, is that while there is this losing patience, it seems like publicly with Ramallah, the U.S. and a Palestinian official I spoke with revealed that actually the funding that the U.S. has been giving to the PA's security forces has continued under this administration. Now, there was some reporting last month that it's actually been cut. I think there was a bit disingenuous because all foreign aid had been cut by the Trump administration on day one. They're doing this 90-day review on all foreign aid. And right now, we're still 2 months in. There's another month left to go until that review is done. So the PA security forces, among other countries except for Israel and Egypt, had their funding paused. But what I've learned is that there's also another massive bucket of funding that the PA security forces get from the CIA. And that funding has continued since and continues to this day from January 20th. And the other thing I was told is that while, yes, that other bucket of funding from the State Department has been halted, after the 98-day review, the PA has been assured that that will resume. So it's getting another big bucket of funding that will continue. It's slated to be about $47 million for the fiscal year of 2025. So I guess you have an interesting split with the Trump administration. Frustrated on the one hand, I spoke with a Palestinian official who said that he thinks it has to do with this expectation that the stipends, that the welfare stipends that people will be getting would be already implemented under the new system. But what I was told is actually the past 2 months since the decree was signed, those payments have stayed the same, and that is because the PA is still catching up on the payments that it's been giving. It's a couple months behind because its financial state is so poor. So the funding just a couple weeks ago, people in the Palestinian Authority received, or people in the West Bank received stipends, the welfare stipends. Some of those included prisoners, and they were based off of the old system because they were getting stipends from January, meaning that they were basically 2 months behind. So the Palestinian official said that in a month or two, we'll get back into the new system where people will be getting updated amounts based off of their financial need and rather than the length that they're serving in prison. And the hope is that, and the Ramallah is that once the Washington sees this, they'll start changing their tone, maybe start having more interactions with Palestinian officials, because we haven't had even a call between Abbas and Trump. The last one they had was in November after Trump won the election, but since January 20th, there hasn't been anything. So I think in Ramallah, they're hoping that once these payments are updated, that you'll see a shift in tone from Washington.
All right, we'll see what happens with that. Thank you, Jacob, for being on today's Daily Briefing.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
For sure. And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always drop us an email, podcast@timesofisrael.com. And of course, feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, have yourselves a good day and take care.